And it says that no, it's not saying we're live yet. It says we're live, and I never know. Zoom keeps changing everything. Facebook keeps changing everything. So, hi, I'm really glad you're all tuning in. And with me today is a guest I'm really excited about interviewing. We've been trying to get our schedules to coincide now for about a month. And with me today is Laura Davis, a very successful author who wrote a book who changed a lot of lives. In a minute, I'm going to actually read her bio to you and something about the book. But right now, I just want to say welcome to the Shame-Free Zone, Laura Davis.
Thank you, Veronica. I've been looking forward to it, and I'm glad we finally came up with a time we had in common.
I am too. And you were traveling abroad, actually. So, and I think that
I'm a writing teacher, and I had taken a group of writers to Tuscany, to a villa for a writing retreat, and then for a couple of weeks, and then I traveled around Europe myself. So okay. Yeah, it was a really fantastic trip. First trip during COVID. It was great.
I'll bet you feel like you were just getting out of prison or something.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As an author, how does one focus on writing when you're in Italy?
Well, I was doing a travel blog, actually. So, part of what I do when I lead these trips, they're called Write, Travel, Transform. And one of the things I do both to model I'm teaching them travel writing. So I need to model it. So I keep a daily blog, which I post. So that kept me writing. And it's fun because when I write about a trip, I experience the trip in a different way because I'm actually every day looking for a story. Like, what's the one thing today that's worth sharing? And then I'll look for that, and then I'll tell. So I'm looking for stories, and I find that my senses are turned on in a much fuller way, so that I'm not just like, I'm not in my head. I'm not thinking about the past, the future. I'm just like in a sensory rich environment, taking in what's going on around me. So I love to write when I travel.
Oh my God, that sounds really intoxicating, actually.
Yeah, I would say so.
So, in a minute, we're going to be taking a deep dive into your book. I do want to hold up the cover. I'm going to do that a few times. The Burning Light of 2 Stars. Laura, I love this book. Just love it. And there's so many ways in which it hits home for me. But first, I want to give all the viewers those that may not know all the wonderful things there are to know about you, just a little bit of bio here. So I'm going to actually put on my reading glasses for this. So here's something about Laura Davis, in case you haven't heard of her before. She's the author of Burning Light of 2 Stars, which is the book we're going to be talking about today. And that's the story of her loving, tumultuous relationship with her mother. And she's also written 6 other nonfiction books. Her first book is actually the one that she really broke out with, and it's called The Courage to Heal. It paved the way for hundreds of thousands of women to heal from the trauma of sexual abuse. I'm a sexual abuse survivor, and for me, Laura Davis' name is iconic in the field of recovery around sexual abuse. She also wrote a book called Becoming the Parent You Want to Be, and that's helped parents develop a vision for the families they want to create. And she also wrote a first book about her mother, which was called I Thought We'd Never Speak Again, The Road from Estrangement to Reconciliation, which teaches skills of reconciliation and peace building from one relationship to another, one relationship at a time. In addition to writing books that inspire, Laura loves to teach. And for more than 20 years, she's helped people find their voices, tell their stories, and hone their craft. And towards the end of today's interview, we're actually going to be talking to her a little bit about what kind of advice she has for those of us that are writing our own books. I'm writing a memoir right now. So I'm really excited to hear what she has to say. Laura loves creating supportive, intimate writing communities online, in person, and internationally. She leads international trips combining writing, cultural learning, and adventure around the world. And in 2023, she'll be taking a lucky group of writers to a villa in Tuscany. And a year from now, she will be hiking and riding on the Camino de Santiago in Spain. This woman gets around.
I also like being at home, I have to say. I'm a homebody when I'm not traveling.
I totally relate to that, Laura. I really do. Laura's writing has appeared in many publications, including Publishers Weekly and the New York Times. And she's been a guest on dozens of podcasts. She's been a featured guest speaker for the National Association of Memoir Writers, as well as a popular craft teacher at the San Miguel Writers Conference. And we will put this in the bottom for you so you don't have to memorize this. But if you want to jot it down right now, you can learn more about Laura's books and workshops. And you can also read the first five chapters of her memoir and receive a free ebook, Writing Through Courage, a 30-day practice, if you just go over to her website, which is lauradavis.net. So, Laura, I'm just wondering, really wondering why you wrote this book. You did write a book about I Thought We'd Never Speak Again. And I'm just wondering, this book, I think, kind of comes out of that, but maybe I'm wrong about that. It feels like a part two to me, but set me straight if I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, I thought we'd never speak again. It's kind of a how-to book. It's general. It's about the process of reconciliation, and it talks about many types of reconciliation, including what happens when you can't directly reconcile with a person, but you have to find that place of peace inside yourself. And so in that book, I interviewed lots and lots of families. I interviewed Vietnam veterans who'd gone back to Vietnam. I talked to people involved in restorative justice. And that book is filled with those types of stories. And there's a little teeny thread that's about my relationship with my mother, which was the motivator for me to get interested in this topic.
Right.
So that book is really a how-to book. And like I said, the small thread that has to do with me and my mother ends with her 70th birthday. And this memoir that I wrote, which is a very deep personal dive into this very challenging lifelong relationship I had with her, it really, the main action happens when begins when she's 80 years old. And one day out of the blue, she calls me from her home in New Jersey. I'm living in California, and she calls to announce she's moving to my town for the rest of her life. And, this is after decades of an incredibly challenging relationship. And we had been completely estranged when I was young. And then we had achieved some degree of reconciliation, which I would have to say was largely based on the fact that we live 3,000 miles apart. Like that geographic distance was very important. So the idea of her moving to my town to end her life and the expectation that I would become her caregiver, and she was starting to have dementia, just sent me into a complete tailspin.
But before you go deeper into that, Laura, can you give our viewers just the backdrop about what it was that had caused the division between the two of you?
Yeah, I think it's complicated. This is not a simple story on any level. And I think my mother I always say she wanted to be the sun, and she expected me to be this little smaller planet orbiting around her. And I just was not a small planet. I had a big personality. And so the two of us were really at war from the time I was an adolescent. And then one thing after another, in terms of the choices I made in my life, just deepened that rift. So, when I was 23, I joined a cult. Well, that would upset any parent, I must say, when I was a teenager. Yeah. When I was 23, I came out to her as a lesbian. She said, "You've confirmed my worst fear about you." So her reaction to everything it was all about her. But the thing that I think you're referring to, what really made us completely split apart, was when I was 27 years old, I began to have memories of having been sexually abused as a child by her father, so my maternal grandfather. And I had blocked this out for many years. It lived in my body, it lived in my cells, but I had no conscious memory of it. And so when I realized that, I was terrified to tell her, but I felt I had to tell her. And when I did, my worst fear was realized, which is that I was going through the absolute worst time in my life, and she abandoned me and attacked me. And so, I realized that to heal from sexual abuse, which I wanted to do, I had to walk away from that relationship and really build a different kind of family, a different kind of support network, which I did. And so it was very hard to come back from that.
Well, and you wrote a book about it to help the rest of us heal.
Courage to Heal.
Was the writing of that book part of your healing process?
Yeah, I would say so, because I interviewed I wrote that book with Ellen Bass, and part of my job in our team was I interviewed over 200 incest survivors, because we really wanted our philosophy of what the healing process would look like to come from the people who knew it best, who were the survivors at that time. I mean, our book was the first book that talked about a healing process. I mean, incest was barely written about, and when it was, the message was, your life is ruined, and there was nothing about what's the way out. So that's the book we wanted to write. And so I interviewed all these survivors, and they were really long interviews, like 3 hours one day, and then a follow-up interview, another 3 hours. So I was getting really deep with all these participants. And I was so much not an objective reporter. If I was going through feeling shut down around sexuality, then I would ask them about their sex lives. If I'd gotten a really nasty accusatory letter from my mother, I would ask them about their relationship with their family. So I cried through the interviews just like they did, so they were good interviews, but, they were very much hooked to my healing process.
Yeah. And I would imagine for them too, because some, as like Vanderkolk shares in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, one of the most powerful ways to heal trauma is that sharing between equals. Yeah. I
mean, the story, telling our story, breaking silence, being witnessed was one of the stages of the healing process that we described. It's a really critical part for any trauma, not just sexual abuse, but any traumatic experience. You need to be witnessed. And I've been teaching writing for over 20 years, and a lot of the basis of the writing circles I lead are that exact same thing, not specifically about sexual abuse. It could be anything, but when someone tells the deep truth of their life, when they commit it to paper, and then when they speak it out through their vocal cords, there's an incredible healing of claiming and owning it. And then when it's witnessed by someone who is not judging or evaluating, but just listening from the deepest place, there's an incredible human connection that's made. And it's at this time when there's so much division between people, this kind of deep writing and sharing can heal divisions, because there's a new podcast the New York Times is putting out, and the tagline is something like, under every opinion there's a story.
I'll have to
and
check
that's
that out.
I've been listening to it. It's quite good. But it's really true that whatever someone's point of view, they got there because there's a story underneath it. And if you understand someone's story, instead of being polarized against them, you can start to understand them and have compassion for them. So I think this kind of work is really critical right now.
Well, I do too. And I'm really glad that you're doing it. There's something that you say about yourself and your mother, and you describe the relationship as a story of two souls who just wouldn't quit each other. I love that. I actually identify with it. I can think of my relationship with my parents. My father molested me, raped my sister when she was 13. My mother denied it until she got dementia, and then started telling me stories about her grandfather molesting her. But I never felt like I got angry. I pulled away. They rejected me. I was scapegoated. My father disowned me when I was 19, and still I just kept coming back to those two people. And I'm just wondering, what was it like for you? And what do you think it was that caused you to not be able to quit each other?
So I want to say something about what you said, because I think it's really important in prefacing any conversation about reconciliation with a perpetrator or with
Yeah.
someone who has betrayed us, is that this is not a necessary part of the healing process. And it's not like the pinnacle or anything like that. And that
Oh,
there are many circumstances where the best thing a survivor can do is walk away, set a boundary, and never look back. And they
absolutely.
could do whatever inner work they need to do to let go of their anger eventually, although anger is a really important motivator for the healing process. But that, the path I took with my mother is not right for everyone. And
Yeah.
I would never want someone to listen to this or read my book and think, oh, I should do that too, because sometimes it's absolutely the wrong choice.
Thank
In
you
my
for
case,
thank you for
yeah, it's
surfacing that.
very important to clarify that. But
It
in
is.
my case, my mother had a lot of great qualities. She was not an evil person. She was broken in certain ways, and she was very challenging as a mother. Lots of other people loved her. Um, so there was good in our relationship that made me want to keep coming back. And I think there was genuine love between the two of us, even though it was pretty buried. In my case, I never made myself vulnerable to her. I didn't feel safe with her, but there was a deep love underneath, and I think we both wanted to get back to that. That's not always the case. I mean, sometimes that doesn't exist. But I think in our case, both of us wanted a relationship with each other, and I think it became more important to me. We had this giant rift over the sexual abuse and over the publication of The Courage to Heal. When I had my first son, I was 35 years old, 36. I wanted her to be his grandmother, and she wanted to be his grandmother. And I had watched her be a grandmother to my niece, and I saw that she actually was a much better grandmother than she was a mother, and that I wanted that. I didn't feel like she was, some people, it would be absolutely the mistake to have that generation in touch with your children, because
Right.
so many perpetrators have abused generation after generation. So I was very aware of what I was doing. I was aware of who she was and what she was capable or not capable of. And I determined that I wanted her in the kids' lives. And I think that motivated us more than anything to, we started out by what I would call agreeing to disagree. There was this huge issue between us, the sexual abuse. But at that point, I had done enough years of healing and enough separation that it wasn't at the forefront of my life anymore. And I no longer needed her acknowledgement. Like, I had enough solidity in myself that what she thought or believed, that wasn't like my line in the sand anymore. And I think her line in the sand had been, Laura has to recant. She has to say this never happened. And she let go of that. And so we basically agreed to disagree. And then there were actually things between us that were positive. And some of them were really small, like we loved to play cards together. We both loved the movies. We liked to cook and entertain and put on like a family party. And we started focusing on some of those things. And around that, we were able to build a different type of relationship. And it was not, I think without deep communication about the issues, there's only so far you could go, but we
That's
created a functional relationship. And that's what we had at the point when she called and said, I'm moving across the country to your town for the rest of my life. And, the thing about dementia, because she was just starting to have it then, is that
Yeah.
it brought out all her worst qualities. She was anxious, she was rageful, she was volatile, she was like, and we became at war over her independence. So
Yeah.
really, we had a second war in this ending period of her life. And so it was very challenging for me. I mean, I had to get myself back into therapy to separate the past from the present. But there was also, part of me that really wanted to know, is it possible for us to heal our relationship the rest of the way? Like, can we get further than we've achieved so
Yeah.
far? before she dies. And I guess I didn't get in her way of coming because there was a part of me that really wanted to see if that was possible. So that was, I think every story, every memoir at least, has some kind of deep underlying question that the author or the protagonist is trying to figure out. And mine was, can you caretake a parent who betrayed you in the past?
Yes. And I want to back up just a little bit because you also say that your mother was very courageous. And one of the things that, look, I published a book actually it was published by Penguin in 2005 about my experiences as a high-end escort. And my mother was horrified. So I already, in so many ways, disappointed my parents and defied them. I left the cult that I was born into and charted this very independent life as an out bisexual woman. My mother was just, so many shades of horrification. And then all of a sudden I put stuff in print.
Right.
And it was an odd thing. So part of her was proud of me for being a published author. And the other part was she shared with me how horrified she'd be if any of the people in her church found out. And I'm just wondering, does your mother's courage pertain any way to you surfacing this family secret that she denied on a public level?
No, that's where she failed. I mean, that's where she had no courage. That was the area in which she was not capable, or chose not to. It's hard to know, to validate me or to stand up for me. But the places she had courage, I told you when I came out to her what she said. You've confirmed my worst fear about you. But in the next few years, she educated herself. She talked to other people, and she came around to be completely supportive of me as a lesbian. And at the end of her life, I've been with my partner, Karen, for like 30 years. And she would just say, this is my daughter-in-law, Karen. Or she'd say, you and Karen have done such a great job with those kids. Who says lesbians shouldn't have children? So that was an area where she showed courage. And also she was the first woman of her generation to get divorced. This is before divorce was everywhere. So she rebuilt her life as a single woman. She became financially independent. She was not wealthy, but she was smart. She was a social worker. It's not like she was a high earner. But so she went from being dependent to being completely independent. She was the only sibling in her family to go to college. She went to City College of New York, which was a free university, but she had to fight my grandfather to go to college, the free college.
Wow.
So there were a lot of things. She was an actor. She traveled the world. I mean, she was a pretty remarkable person if I step back and out of my relationship with her. And I think she did demonstrate a lot of courage. It's just that not in all the areas I wished she could have. Because, and the other thing is interesting, she died 8 years ago, and the anniversary of her death was just a few weeks ago. So I was thinking about her.
Wow.
And I had this new insight about her, which was that she was an incredibly loyal person. And I always just thought about how much she betrayed me, but I realized that she betrayed me because she was being loyal to her dead father. Like, she was still being loyal, but it was just to someone else.
Yeah.
And that loyalty, even though she couldn't come through for me around the sexual abuse, there were other ways that she didn't, like, I came from a Jewish family. She didn't sit Shiva and consider me dead. She kept fighting for a relationship between us.
Yeah.
And I kept fighting for a relationship with her. And I always had to be thinking, I wanted to be sure I wasn't selling myself out in any way. And I wasn't, because I never stopped standing up for the truth of what I knew had happened. I mean, I published it. I went on Oprah. I couldn't have been more public about this situation. So I think as I've gotten older, I've moved from being a very black and white thinker, this is right, this is wrong, to things are very complicated. They're very complex, and that there are sometimes ways to resolve things that are way out of the box of what you think the options are. And that's what the two of us found.
Yes. And so to highlight that, which really is like this capacity for forgiveness and compassion, like understanding what this other person's going through and what motivates them, why they're doing this thing that is really hurting us and harming us. I'm wondering, would you be willing to read a little bit from page 73 from your book? I think that this, for me, now maybe it's just me because similar things happened in my family. And when I read this part of your book, I was just like, oh my God, somebody lived through something similar. I can't believe this. And I've read a lot of stuff about childhood sexual abuse. So I would have thought I would have seen something that evoked this similarity in the past, but I hadn't. So maybe
Sure.
I look at it and go, how is it that we can forgive this? Because it's just it's generational trauma and it's being normalized.
Right.
I would love for you to read it for us and then unpack it for us.
Okay. So, as I said, most of this story takes place from the time my mother's 80 years old until her death. That's like one thread, kind of the main story. But there are a lot of other chapters that give some of the history and go back in time so that the reader can understand exactly why our relationship was so deeply fraught.
Yeah.
And this is one of those chapters that take place in the past. And it's called Dirty Old Man. And my mother's name, what you need to know before I read this, my mother's name was Temme. And at this point in the story, you'll have known that my grandfather sexually abused me. And you'll know that I have not remembered it at this point.
Yeah.
So those are the two main things.
Really important.
And I think there may be a mention of my father, dad, and my brother Paul. They're just mentioned in passing. Dirty Old Man. Laura, 14, Temme, 43, New York City. The summer of 1971, my breasts grew overnight, and I didn't know what to do with them. I covered them with baggy shirts, but they rose like mountains anyway. When I walked down the street, cars slowed and men whistled. I was propositioned all the time. 2 years earlier, I was certain I'd be flat-chested forever. I begged Mom to get me one of those frilly white AA bras that the other undeveloped girls wore. But she didn't believe in training bras. You've got nothing to put in them. You're flat as a pancake. Then suddenly, in 2 months, my breasts ballooned past triple D. I hunched my shoulders in a vain attempt to hide my chest. My blonde hair, which had always been straight, transformed into a wavy curtain. I parted it in the middle and let it drape straight down to cover my blackheads and the hard tan polka dots of Clearasil that peppered my face. Midway through the summer, Mom and I drove to New York to see Bubby and Papa, and that's the names of my grandparents. That's what we called them. It was just the two of us. Dad was living at Project Artaud painting giant murals, and Paul was away at the University of Colorado driving an old hearse. Mom and I arrived to New York alone. At 14, I still had no conscious memory of my grandfather's abuse, but other things about him made me drag my feet that day. I was dreading a ritual that had long been practiced in my family. As all the girls, Mom, her sisters, Bea and Ruth, and all the girl cousins before me reached adolescence, Papa insisted that they lift their shirts and bare their budding breasts for his inspection. It was a rite of passage, a family tradition. After Papa unlocked the 2 deadbolts and the chain, we entered the dark apartment. There were the familiar sepia photos from the old country, a Yiddish newspaper strewn on a chair, the sizzling smell of latkes. Papa took in my new chest and chuckled with delight. Are they growing yet? I shrank away from my body until I could no longer feel the sticky summer heat on my skin. Just a cool, empty place inside. Mom looked at me expectantly. Papa waited for me to comply. Let me see, just a little peek. I said it lightly. Wasn't this all just an amusing little joke? I fingered the hem of my white peasant shirt. The embroidery on top was turquoise, green, and gold. They were looking at me, waiting. Papa's eyes gleamed with anticipation. No, the word ignited from somewhere deep inside me. Mom's face hardened. Lori, what's the big deal? Do you have to be so unpleasant? We all did it. I pulled the bottom of my shirt down over my jeans. The words tumbled out of an unfamiliar place. I don't want to. Mom's eyes flared with anger and her shoulders squared. Don't be so uptight, Lori. It will only take a minute. She looked at me appraisingly as she had so many times before. You have a lovely figure. You have nothing to be ashamed of. That's where the memory ends. The only thing I know for sure is that I didn't lift up my shirt and that I was the only girl in the family ever to refuse. Sometimes when I think back to this moment, I imagine it happening at another time of year, with our whole family crammed into that tiny apartment, at a Seder maybe. In that version, I see my teenage self standing up to all of them, every one of my aunts and cousins, all the women and girls, the ones from the past and the ones from the future, all the Ross women, generations of them shouting, "Why are you making such a big deal about this? We all did it." A whole chorus of shirt lifters clamoring for me to bare my chest. Just one look. Give the dirty old man one look. But I didn't listen to any of them. Not the ones who were there, not the ones in my head. A kernel of resistance rose up inside me. I said no. It would be years before I'd remembered what had happened with Papa when I was small. But someone fierce woke up inside me that day. She soon dropped back into slumber, but she was there.
I love that chapter. It's my favorite chapter in the whole book. Just
Sounds like you had some similar.
I had yes, similar things, and finally having to say no in the way that I said no, and being the only one who did, and just it takes so much courage to get to that place. So much courage.
I don't even know if it was courage. It just, I said, it was like part of me just woke up and came out. You know, it wasn't something I considered. It just burst out of me and shocked me. You know, I certainly walked into that apartment expecting to acquiesce. I knew what was coming, you know.
Wow. So it's very emotional. That part of your book is incredibly emotional. There's lots of emotional aspects of the book, but that one really hits home for me. So I'm trying to gather my interview skills here. Get back on topic. I'm wanting to ask you, because I certainly have had those moments where my mother is either pretending or in some way enabling my abuse, or she's pretending that it's not happening. That was one of her favorite things. But to get to this place where we can actually still want to have a relationship with our mother, even though she didn't do anything to defend us or protect us. I'm just wondering if you have anything you want to say about that in regards to your relationship with Temme.
Well, I think that the only reason I was able to renew my relationship with her in my case was because I separated from her. Like if I had been going back because I was desperate, because I couldn't live without her, because I couldn't separate, it would have continued that same unhealthy dynamic. And I don't think that would have been a good thing. So, for me, I had to completely separate. I had to become an autonomous person um, that didn't need her in order to reconsider. If I had to do my own healing work first, and only then was I able to look back. There's as I was reading that, I was thinking about something, which was that moment where she's like looking at me appraisingly. She was always checking out my body and commenting on my weight, and I just hated it. And she wanted me to get my breasts reduced. She wanted me to get my nose fixed. I mean, she was always like wanting to. I think really she was afraid I was a lesbian, probably, and wanted to like feminize me. When I look at back now, but that always was deeply. I would get enraged when she would do those things. And when I had a daughter, I have a daughter who's 25 now. And when Eliza was a teenager and younger, my mother would look at her the same way and make comments about her body. And I would get really pissed off and say, you can't do that. I don't want you speaking to her that way. I would come in to protect her. And Lizzie, we called her Lizzie back then, she would just say, Mom, it's no big deal to me. Or she'd say, this is your thing with your mom. It's not mine. Like, so that was really interesting. This talking about things being passed or not passed through the generations, that what was a trigger for me was not a trigger for my daughter. She just either didn't pay attention to it or she felt flattered by it, but she didn't. And it's interesting that she and her grandmother were both much more into vanity and looks and all that than I went in the opposite direction. So they actually had more of that in common. So that was, for me, that was just a really interesting observation about things going through the generations.
Yeah. Well, it is. And I mean, I've seen that. I've seen like grandparents and grandkids can sometimes really talk to each other and connect. Because they don't have the triggers and the trauma between them. But also, let's not forget that it was your grandfather that was molesting you. So that was generational trauma that was certainly carried forward.
Absolutely. And, no one in my whole extended family has ever come forward and said it happened to them. And, I mean, men don't start molesting girls at 70 years old.
No.
But, I'll never get that validation directly. So, I can make all kinds of assumptions. And the other thing that's interesting, I've thought about my mother's, because I feel like my relationship with her continues after she died, but is that in some ways I feel like the way she raised me and things she modeled for me gave me the courage to face and name and stand up about the sexual abuse, something she was not capable of doing. It's almost like the image I've had this recently, it's almost like she pushed me across the finish line, but she couldn't get there herself.
Yeah.
And some of that has to do with, my generation and, rights for women and all the struggles for equality that people have had that have empowered people. I mean, of course, everything's going backwards now, or there's such a backlash right now. But, but I was able to do something and show a kind of courage that my mother couldn't show in this area. And ironically, even though she tried to thwart me and condemn me for it, in some ways, the way I was raised, in part by her, my father too, gave me the courage to stand up like that.
Laura, absolutely. And when I was in college, in 1982, I was volunteering for a Center Against Rape and Domestic Violence. And we were just starting to use that word incest and talk about it. You certainly didn't hear about child sexual assault on the news. It wasn't written about. It was like really suppressed. When I think about the pedophilia that travels on both sides of my family, the maternal and the paternal side, I feel so much compassion for these people because they don't even have the words. that just don't have the words to know what's happening to them. And certainly, even getting therapy from my parents' generation, that's like, you don't do that. So I think there's a lot of, I'm not going to call it privilege, but in contrast to the opportunities that they had, a lot of potential and opportunities for healing. And of course, Laura, you've been a big part of making that available to lots and lots of people.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of sad because when Ellen Bass and I wrote The Courage to Heal, we were writing it in 1985. It was published in 1988. And we naively believed all we have to do is put this book out there and then this will stop. Like once people know what they have to do to heal, and once the problem is named, then, this book will become obsolete, and instead it's being used by, 3 generations down from that. And so that's really sad that it's still needed because, these things have continued. They keep going and going and going. We see it. We see it in families. We see it in war. We see it everywhere,
Well, don't get me started on patriarchy.
Why not?
We should. Patriarchy is really out of control right now. I would like to ask you, and by the way, we can talk about patriarchy if you want to, but I also realize that we're starting to run out of time, and I wanted to touch into the dementia aspect of this story. And now my mother has severe Alzheimer's, and my dog's got dementia right now. So I know what a challenging thing that can be. And I'm just wondering if you want to share anything about how that shaped your healing journey. Like, did it facilitate the healing or impede it?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And, it's going to be different for everyone. When my mother started going down that road of dementia, I was convinced that she was going to turn nasty, that like her worst qualities would be exacerbated. And at first, actually, they were in the early stages, but I got really lucky. And as her dementia progressed, she became very sweet. And that kind of rage, anger, anxiety, it all smoothed out. And she became very loving. And she was living in assisted living for a period of time. And I felt like the way I described it was, I felt like there was a new umbilical cord between us. Like I felt compelled to go see her every day, every other day. And I would go both with love and dread, and I would walk into her room and I would like brace myself to walk in that room. But when I walked in, she'd be sitting on the couch looking dead, actually. I mean, she just would look like her teeth would be out, and she had that like mask on her face. I thought, this is how she'll look when she's dead. And, she'd just be vegging out basically. And I would come in and like, she'd open her eyes and she would see me. And it was like this joy would just suffuse her face. And she would just beam this love at me and just say, Lori, you're the best daughter in the whole world. It's like I had longed my whole life to get this simple, uncomplicated love from my mother. And finally, at the end of her life, I was getting it. But who was I getting it from? I was getting it from someone who was a shell of who she had been. And so it was a very complex, and I'd drink this in, and then I'd also be like, when could I get out of here? Because it was just so painful to watch her decline. So in some ways, her dementia, for me, enabled me to feel safe to love her because she was no longer a threat to me. Yeah. And so it enabled me to open my heart, which is kind of what I had hoped for when she moved to California, was like, is it possible for me to actually allow myself to love her and not just have every kind of barrier up? I'm going to protect myself from this evil person. So for me, it was a benefit, and in some ways, and it was also, excruciating. And, and then anyone who's dealt with someone with dementia knows that there's this stage and that stage and this stage and that stage. And being a caregiver is very rough. And I wanted to in my book, it was really important to me that I tell the truth about being a caregiver, that I didn't want to write some like Hallmark card kind of story. So I really told the truth, including my deep failings in that process, and and also the moments I was successful, or able to be the daughter I wanted to be, and the moments I couldn't. So
That's
that's what I wanted to tell.
that's one point I want to touch on before we close out today, is what you learned about yourself and sharing our failings. Like I'm writing a memoir right now, and I'm intent on busting this polarized paradigm that we have about perpetrators and victims. And because my father's an incest survivor, and so's my mother. And I actually have confirmation of that from the family history. So I see both in them. And I'm putting, my mistakes in my book. And you don't see that very often. In most books, people kind of wear this mantle of
Right, the hero.
Yeah. So how is that for you?
Well, part of it was I never wanted to villainize my mother. Like I had no interest in writing a revenge book. I don't like to read revenge books. When my students are going in that direction, I really try to steer them away from it, because who wants to read that? I don't think very many people do. I think we want to read stories about complex, challenged characters, and no one wants to read a book where you're the hero and you do everything right, where you're the victim and everything happened to you and you had no efficacy in your life.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write a good book. I mean, I wanted to write a riveting story, and I wanted it to be really well written. I mean, I am a writing teacher. It wasn't just personal to get my story out. I wanted to write a good read. And at an early stage, I had a colleague who's a writing teacher, creative writing teacher for many decades. And she just said to me, Laura, you're making your mother look bad and you're the hero. And she said, she really read me the riot act. And she said, this isn't the courage to heal, referring to my first book. She said, this is the courage to reveal. And so I put those words up on my wall, like over where I would see them when I was at my computer writing.
Oh,
It's the courage to reveal. And so I began to show more of my own underbelly, and the book got exponentially better.
yeah. Well put. Nobody wants to read a story where somebody portrays themselves as the hero or the victim. We want real people. And I think that's how we relate, and it's how we learn and grow. And there's a lot of healing in that. I'm wondering, what kind of advice would you like to give to those who are watching right now who would like to write their own book about healing or revealing or any of the other
About
topics
anything,
you
about
cover?
anything. I mean, I don't just work with people who are writing trauma stories by any means. The people have lots of reasons for wanting to tell part of their life. It could be their spiritual journey. It could be, a family epic. It could be about working with a disability. It could be, just could be a travel memoir. And I think the important thing first is to just get the story out, and that the first draft is a process of discovery. You're discovering your story as you go along. I mean, with memoir, with fiction, maybe you could do more planning, but I think with a memoir, you just want to write everything. And then you have to think, as I said, each memoir should have a question. A memoir is not everything that happened to you in your life. It's not an autobiography that starts with, I was born, and then I went to this school, and then we moved here, and then I got married, and then and then. That's really, really tedious. What it is, it's a story from a life. So in my case, it was the story of my relationship with my mother, and anything that wasn't pertaining to that, I didn't include in this book.
Yeah.
I might write another memoir about something else if I wanted to. So I think that's the first thing, is just get the story out. And then, I think you really need support to write, whether it's, joining a writing group, whether it's having friends who are writers, whether it's getting a coach or an editor, or a whole variety of things. That I don't think writing really happens well in a vacuum, despite what people think. That it's important at certain stages along the way to get people to respond, to see if you're reaching people. And there's a difference between writing something for yourself, and I have lots of students who don't aspire to publish. They're writing the story because they want to get it down. They're writing it for their children, their grandchildren. They're writing it because it's the best way for them to come to terms with what happened and to understand it in a deeper way. But their goal is not to entertain, to inform, or to, have something that people who don't know them would want to read. And that kind of writing is held to a different standard than if you want to write something and publish it. Then you have to not just be telling your story the way you want to, you have to be thinking about a reader's experience.
Yeah.
What is it like for a reader to read this book? And that's like a whole different, there's a whole set of skills in being, writing is not just like you feel inspired and you put things down. It's a skill, just like learning to play an instrument or learning to speak a language. And it takes a long apprenticeship to be able to write well. And I certainly support people who are just writing for self-expression, writing as a way to heal, writing as a way to grieve. I think that's all very, very important. It's kind of the core of what I've taught for many years. But I also work with people who want to go beyond that and then do something with that writing. And that requires a different kind of application of attention and effort.
For those of us who do want to get published, I'm thinking about, I'm reading a memoir right now from another child abuse. She's actually a child sex trafficking survivor. And she's a woman whose work in the world I really admire. But I'm finding this book a real slog to get through. And the primary reason is that she just seems to be recounting all the trauma. So I'm wondering, if somebody, myself included, I'm definitely writing about heavy topics, wants to write about heavy topics, and we're taking the reader's experience into consideration. Do you have any advice about how you write about that?
Yes, definitely. My coach, Joshua Townsend, who I don't think I would have finished this memoir. I don't think I could have finished it without his help, because he taught me so much about storytelling and pacing and how to create a compelling narrative. He one of the things he taught me was establish and move on. So you're talking about trauma. Let's say, for instance, a woman is writing a story about having been battered in a relationship. There might be, 50 incidents of violence, of things that happened.
Right.
And you don't need to write about all 50. Think about it like if you were skipping a rock over a river and it would like touch down at different points, but it wouldn't go through the whole water. So what are some of the pivotal moments? So like in the example I'm giving, maybe the first time there was a hint of control or violence and the woman ignored it. That might be a scene.
Right.
And then there might be the first time there was a physical attack. That might be the second scene. And then there might be the time she tried to leave but went back. Yeah. And then there might be the worst moment that finally motivated her to get out. But you don't need the 50 incidents that happened in between, and most people don't want to just read a book that's too trauma heavy. And the other thing about writing traumatic scenes is that we don't need all the details of what happened. Sometimes you just give a hint of what happened. And we all know about rape. We all know about sexual abuse. We all know about we all have these experiences or know of them. So we don't need every little detail. If you give a few salient details, the reader will be able to fill in the rest. Otherwise, you're going to re-traumatize the reader and re-traumatize yourself in writing it. So writing about trauma is, again, if you're writing as a therapeutic tool, sometimes you need to write every detail because you need to get it out of your body and onto the page. But when you're crafting it into a story, sometimes people need to slow down and say more, and sometimes they need to say less. It just depends on the writer and what I'm seeing on the page, what kind of advice I would give. But we need to know that that there's more to the story than that. What else is part of that? And often when I read a novel or a memoir, I'll just feel like this person needed an editor. Like I didn't need to go through this again. Like I already know it was bad. I don't need to know it was bad again. And then it
Yeah.
was bad again. Does that make sense?
Yes. No, actually, this is really helping me understand why I'm not enjoying this book, because I've been so galvanized around survivors' rights and survivor stories for decades, and I'm just like, why do I hate this book? Just like, her story deserves to be told, but yeah, it's just there is nothing else in it but the drama. So thank you for helping me understand that and that balance there. I love your metaphor about skipping the rock over the lake. That's a really beautiful metaphor. So you just touch down on the salient points. And it kind of reminds me of screenwriting, when you're doing a movie, that you want to have those pivotal scenes, but you can't tell the whole life. And
well, a memoir is exactly the same.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll have people like, they're writing about a certain topic, and I'll have the first assignment would be make a list of the major turning points. Like if it's a relationship, in your relationship with your wife or your husband, or what were the major turning points, and then those become the scenes. And I've thought about my mother that way. What were the pivotal moments in my relationship with my mother? And those are the ones I wrote, and they didn't all make it into the book because some of them basically covered the same ground as the one before.
Right.
What new information is this adding that the reader doesn't already have? And you have to cross-examine every chapter, every paragraph, every sentence with that question. Why does this deserve real estate in your book? And the answer, because it happened, is not a good enough answer.
And then we have to do that horrible thing of killing our darlings.
It gets easier. The more experienced you are as a writer, it becomes easier to throw things away.
Okay. I'm going to take that on faith. Before we close, you obviously are a very good instructor for writing. I've learned a lot in just 5 minutes, and I look forward to taking training from you. How can our viewers access your trainings?
So everything is on my website, lauradavis.net. I teach weekly classes online, so people can take them from anywhere in the world. Yeah. I also teach retreats. I have one coming up that's about grief and loss that I teach every year. I'm taking, as you said at the beginning, I'm taking people traveling next summer, both back to Tuscany, which I loved, and then a hiking trip on the Camino with a little bit of writing and creating a travel journal. And I offer other kinds of things from time to time, work weekends where people could come for 3 days online and just work intensively on their project and get feedback. All of that is at www.lauradavis.net. And if you get on my mailing list there, you'll start receiving weekly writing prompts, which can just be part of your ongoing writing practice to keep you going.
Beautiful. I'm going to post everything, of course, below this interview on Facebook.
And my social media links are there too. My social media links are on my website.
Awesome.
Too.
Laura, I really enjoyed meeting you here, having this conversation with you, and it's been so deep and so soulful, and I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. I enjoyed it too. I feel like we've just been the two of us alone having this conversation.
I know. It's been beautiful. Okay.
All right. Until next time.
We'll say now for now. Bye for now, but there'll be more, I hope.
All right.
All right.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.